Have you ever bought or sold something on Craigslist? Maybe met a stranger in a parking lot or went to someone's house to pick up a free item? For most people, it's a routine exchange, but for some, it's a nightmare. Today, I'm sharing 5 true horror stories from people who answered Craigslist ads and lived to tell the tale. You might want to think twice before your next Craigslist meetup. The free couch. Sarah had just moved to a new city for a fresh start. Money was tight, and her new apartment was a bit bare. She scrolled through Craigslist hoping to find something to spruce up the place when she stumbled on what felt like the perfect ad. A free couch in good condition, just a few miles away. The ad was simple, but there was a photo of a decently clean couch in a tidy apartment. The seller mentioned it was just too big for his new space, and the deal seemed ideal. When Sarah messaged the seller, he responded quickly. He said his name was Dan and was polite, even friendly. He asked her if she could come by around dusk as he worked late. Sarah felt a slight unease at the thought of going to a stranger's apartment alone, but she rationalized it. This was a free couch, after all, and it was exactly what she needed. She quickly texted her roommate the address and said, "Just picking up a couch, should be back in 30. As Sarah drove to Dan's address, she noticed the area felt a bit isolated. The apartment complex itself looked older and a bit worn down, but it was one of those old buildings that had a retro charm, so she tried not to let her nerves get the best of her. She parked and walked up to his door, repeating her plan in her head. Grab the couch, say thanks, and get out of there. Dan opened the door, and his appearance was a little different than she'd imagined. He looked like the photo he'd sent, but in person, he had a strange energy, almost too intense. As he led her inside, he didn't make much small talk, but instead launched right into asking her questions. Did you come alone? How far did you drive? Is anyone waiting for you? Each question felt probing, and she started to feel the first pangs of real discomfort. When she casually mentioned that her roommate knew she was here, his face changed, his smile slipping for a moment before returning. They reached the living room, and there was the couch, a nice enough piece of furniture, if a bit dingier than it had looked in the photo. She approached it, running her hand along the fabric as Dan watched her carefully. Then he moved closer, uncomfortably close, and asked her if she'd like to stay for a drink. Sarah hesitated, every instinct telling her to leave. She politely declined, mentioning she had to get back to her roommate. But Dan didn't back off. Instead, he pressed again, asking if she had a boyfriend, if she went out much, if she liked to hang out and unwind. Sarah forced a laugh, trying to make a light excuse to leave, but as she turned toward the door, she felt his hand on her arm. "Just one drink. I don't get much company," he said in a soft but unsettling tone. Sarah felt a chill run through her. She muttered something about needing to get her friend's help to carry the couch and started moving toward the exit. Dan tightened his grip, asking her again if she was sure she had to leave so soon. Panic set in, and Sarah yanked her arm free, muttering, "I really have to go." She walked briskly toward the door, her mind racing as she tried to stay calm. She didn't want to make him angry, but every part of her screamed that she needed to get out. When she reached the door, she could feel him right behind her, hovering, his footsteps quiet but deliberate. She opened it as fast as she could, not daring to look back. Once outside, she all but ran to her car. Her heart hammered as she looked over her shoulder and saw him standing in the doorway, staring at her, his face twisted with what looked like disappointment, and maybe something darker. She fumbled with her keys, finally getting the car door open and slipping inside, locking the doors the second she was in. She couldn't shake the feeling that he'd watch her until she was out of sight. As she drove away, she looked in her rearview mirror and saw him still standing there, watching her, his face illuminated in the glow of the porch light. Once she was a safe distance away, Sarah pulled over, shaking as she replayed the scene in her mind. She decided to search online for his address, wondering if there had been any other complaints or reports from the building. Her hands were trembling as she typed. She didn't expect to find much, but then she froze. In the results, she saw an article from a local paper about a man arrested in that very apartment complex. someone who had been luring young women with fake Craigslist ads. It described in disturbing detail how he would manipulate them into visiting his apartment, often targeting people who were new to the area or looking for free or cheap furniture. The description matched Dan almost exactly, but the article was dated a couple of years back. He must have somehow avoided conviction or was out on bail. As she sat in her car, staring at her phone, she realized just how close she'd come to being one of his victims. The roommate from hell. James had been struggling to find an affordable apartment in his city. After weeks of searching, he was thrilled when he found a Craigslist listing for a one-bedroom apartment in a decent area for a price that was almost too good to be true. The ad mentioned that the unit was in a two-bedroom apartment where he'd share the space with a man named Tom, described as a chill, older dude who mostly kept to himself. James set up a time to meet Tom, who invited him over to check out the apartment. When James arrived, the building looked a bit rundown, but it wasn't anything too concerning. Inside, the apartment itself was surprisingly clean and orderly, and Tom was polite, even friendly. He seemed to be in his late 50s, with an air of quiet intensity, but he seemed harmless enough. Tom explained that he was often out on business and wouldn't be around much. He stressed that he was looking for a good, reliable roommate and asked James a few standard questions about his job and hobbies, all while staring at him with an unsettling focus. Despite this, the price and convenience were hard to resist. Eager to move in, James signed a lease on the spot and moved in the next day. At first, everything was fine. Tom kept to himself, and they rarely interacted outside of a polite nod in the kitchen or a quick hello if they happened to cross paths in the hallway. But then, about a week after moving in, things took an unexpected turn. It started with small, subtle intrusions. James would come home from work to find that his bedroom door, something he always kept closed, was slightly ajar. Items on his desk would be moved around, and once he found his closet door open, even though he was certain he'd closed it that morning. He tried to brush it off as forgetfulness, but the odd incidents kept happening, each one more unsettling than the last. One night, James was sitting in his room, watching a movie on his laptop, when he noticed something odd. The door had been left slightly open, and as he glanced up, he saw Tom standing in the hallway, watching him through the crack. His face was barely visible in the dim light, but his eyes glinted in the darkness. James froze, unsure if Tom had been watching him or if he'd just happened to walk by. Trying to act casual, James asked if he needed something, but Tom just muttered, "Just checking in," and walked away without another word. The incidents escalated over the next few days. Tom would knock on James's door at odd hours, asking if he was awake, if he was alone, or if he wanted to hang out. James tried to ignore it, but one night he woke up around 3 a.m. to see Tom standing at the foot of his bed, staring down at him. He nearly screamed, but Tom just shushed him, saying he was just making sure everything was all right. James's heart pounded as he tried to shake off the fear. He asked Tom to leave his room, and Tom complied, but he lingered in the doorway, watching James as he closed the door. That night, James barely slept, and he began making plans to move out as soon as possible. But Tom wasn't done. The next morning, when James went to the bathroom, he noticed something strange on the shelf behind the shower curtain. A small, black device with a blinking red light. He realized with horror that it was a hidden camera. A chill ran down his spine as he scanned the bathroom, noticing another tiny device tucked behind a shampoo bottle. He felt sick. How long had these cameras been here? How many other places in the apartment had Tom hidden them? James couldn't contain his panic anymore. He quickly grabbed his things, intending to confront Tom before leaving. But when he walked into the living room, he found Tom already waiting for him, as if he'd been anticipating this moment. Tom's expression was calm, almost amused. Before James could say anything, Tom held up his phone, playing back footage from the hidden cameras. He smiled and asked, "Where do you think you're going?" In that moment, James realized he was trapped. He felt an overwhelming sense of dread as he tried to think of an excuse. He mumbled something about needing to grab coffee with a friend, trying to sound casual, but Tom's eyes didn't leave his face. "You're not going anywhere," Tom said, his voice cold and menacing. You're staying right here. We have things to discuss." James's heart was pounding, but he forced himself to stay calm. He told Tom he'd be back soon and tried to make his way to the door, but Tom blocked his path, his smile fading. "You're my roommate now," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "You're going to stay, understand? I chose you for a reason." Terrified, James agreed, desperately trying to mask his panic. As soon as Tom moved to get his phone, James darted for the door, flinging it open and sprinting down the hallway as fast as he could. He didn't stop running until he was several blocks away, his lungs burning and his heart racing. Once he was a safe distance away, he called the police and reported everything he'd experienced. When they investigated the apartment, they found cameras hidden not only in the bathroom but also in James's bedroom, as well as in various parts of the apartment. Tom was arrested, and it turned out he had a history of disturbing behavior with previous roommates, all of whom had reported feeling watched, but had never been able to prove anything. The experience left James traumatized. He'd only been in that apartment for a few short weeks, but those weeks felt like an eternity. He'd later learned that Tom had a long history of renting out his extra room and then terrorizing his roommates in bizarre and invasive ways. In some cases, they'd find videos of themselves online, recordings Tom had secretly uploaded. It took James months to feel safe again, but he never forgot his roommate from hell. Now, he warns everyone he meets to be cautious when finding roommates online. The rare toy collector. Melissa was a die-hard vintage toy collector. She had spent years hunting down rare pieces and prided herself on her impressive collection of antique dolls and figurines. Her dedication had made her a regular on various resale platforms, where she scoured listings daily. So when she found an ad on Craigslist for a rare, limited edition doll from the 1960s, she was thrilled. The doll was supposedly in near-mint condition, and the seller was only asking a fraction of what it would typically go for on the market. The listing was from a man named Harold, who claimed the doll had belonged to his late mother. He sounded friendly and a bit quirky, but harmless. He explained that he wasn't attached to his mother's eccentric collection and wanted to find someone who'd appreciate the doll. They arranged a time for her to pick it up, and while Harold suggested meeting at his apartment, Melissa was too excited to hesitate. She quickly agreed and drove out to meet him the following evening. When she arrived, Melissa noticed the apartment building had a worn-down look, almost as if it had been untouched for years. The building was dimly lit with old peeling paint and had an eerie quietness that made her stomach twist a bit. She pushed down her unease, reminding herself that Harold was just an elderly man with an unusual collection. She finally found his apartment, knocked, and waited. Harold answered the door with a warm smile, though something about him felt off. He was tall and thin, with sunken eyes and a pale, almost waxy complexion. His apartment was dimly lit and smelled faintly of mildew. Still, Melissa kept a polite smile, doing her best to appear at ease. He invited her in, and when she stepped inside, she immediately felt a strange chill. The room was cluttered with shelves of antique dolls, each one staring out with blank, lifeless eyes. Some of the dolls looked very old, with cracked faces and missing eyes, while others looked newer, but no less disturbing. Come in," Harold said, closing the door behind her. "The doll you want is right over here. I kept it in mint condition." He led her deeper into the apartment, and as she followed him, she noticed even more dolls lining the walls, arranged in strange, almost unnatural poses, as if they were caught mid-action in some eerie, silent game. There were dolls on the shelves, on the tables, even on the floor, each one more unsettling than the last. Melissa couldn't help but feel as if they were watching her, their glassy eyes tracking her every move. "Here it is," Harold said, stopping in front of a cabinet. Inside was the doll she'd come to buy, and it was indeed in remarkable condition. She reached out to examine it, but Harold placed a hand on her shoulder. "Before you take her, there's something you should know," he whispered, leaning uncomfortably close. Melissa felt her skin crawl, but she forced a smile. "Oh, what's that?" she asked, trying to keep her voice light. Harold's face twisted into a strange expression. "She's part of my collection," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "No one has ever taken one of my dolls and left without becoming part of the collection too." Melissa laughed nervously, hoping he was joking, but his expression didn't change. The silence stretched on, and she began to feel genuinely afraid. "That's an interesting story," she managed to say, trying to keep the mood light. "But I really should be going. Maybe I'll come back another time." As she turned to leave, Harold blocked her path, his eyes narrowing. No, he said quietly. "You came all this way. It would be rude to leave without taking the doll." His hand tightened on her shoulder, and for the first time, Melissa felt a pang of true panic. "I think I left my wallet in the car," she blurted, hoping to make an excuse to get out of there. "I'll just go grab it and be right back." Harold stared at her for a moment, his expression unreadable, and then he slowly nodded. "All right, but hurry back. I wouldn't want anything to happen to you out there." Melissa quickly stepped back, her heart pounding, and made her way to the door. As she reached for the doorknob, she felt Harold's gaze burning into her back. She swung the door open and stepped into the hallway, breathing a sigh of relief as she put distance between herself and the apartment. But as she turned the corner toward the stairs, she heard Harold's voice calling after her. "You're going to be part of my collection," he shouted, his voice echoing down the hall. She didn't turn back. She sprinted down the stairs, nearly tripping in her haste, and ran straight to her car. She jumped in, locked the doors, and fumbled with her keys until the engine roared to life. She looked up at the apartment building and saw Harold standing in the window, watching her with an intense, almost hungry expression. Melissa sped away, her hands shaking as she gripped the wheel. She couldn't shake the feeling that she'd narrowly escaped something truly sinister. After a few miles, she pulled over to catch her breath. Her heart was racing, and her mind was spinning as she replayed the encounter in her head. Later that night, she decided to search for information about Harold and his collection. She couldn't help but feel that his behavior was more than just creepy. It was menacing. After digging through old news articles online, she stumbled on a chilling story. Harold had been questioned several years earlier in connection with a series of disappearances. The missing people had all been women who had answered his Craigslist ads for antique items. Though the police had never found enough evidence to charge him, he'd been a primary suspect in each case. The more Melissa read, the sicker she felt. Each of the missing women had been last seen going to his apartment. Even more disturbing was an old photo included in one of the articles. It showed the police investigating his apartment, with rows of dolls lining the shelves and tables. Melissa's stomach turned as she recognized some of the dolls she'd seen earlier that day. Her mind raced as she thought back to the eerie, lifelike poses of the dolls in his apartment, their hauntingly human expressions. She wondered with a shiver if he had somehow preserved his victims in those dolls, adding them to his collection in a twisted attempt to keep them close forever. Shaken and horrified, Melissa deleted her Craigslist account and vowed never to meet with a stranger alone again. She couldn't shake the feeling that she had come perilously close to joining his collection herself. To this day, she refuses to buy toys or dolls online, haunted by the memory of Harold's cold stare and the disturbing, silent company that filled his apartment. The car on the side of the road. It was nearly midnight, and Daniel was driving home after a long shift. The road was desolate, lined with dense woods on both sides, and only the occasional flickering streetlight broke up the darkness. He'd driven this route many times before, but something about that night felt different. A thick fog was starting to roll in, making it hard to see more than a few yards ahead. He was starting to get uneasy when he noticed a car pulled over on the shoulder, its hazard lights blinking weakly in the fog. Normally, Daniel would have driven right by, but as he got closer, he noticed a figure standing beside the car, waving for help. The figure was a woman, alone, looking anxious and cold in the misty night air. Against his better judgment, he slowed down and pulled over a few feet ahead of her car. He lowered his window slightly, keeping his guard up. "Need some help?" he called out, trying to keep his voice steady. The woman walked up to his window with an expression of relief. She looked like she'd been standing there for a while, her face pale and tired. "Yes, please. My car just died, and I don't have cell service out here. Could you give me a lift to the nearest town?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. Daniel hesitated. He knew better than to pick up strangers, especially late at night. But something about her desperation struck him, and he couldn't bring himself to leave her stranded. He unlocked the passenger door and watched as she climbed in, her movements slow and careful. She settled into the seat with a small sigh of relief, though her hands continued to shake. As they drove, Daniel tried to make small talk to ease the tension. "Rough night, huh? This road can be pretty creepy, especially at night," he said, attempting a light-hearted chuckle. But she didn't laugh. She just nodded, staring out the window with a distant look in her eyes. "Yeah, it's strange out here," she murmured, her voice barely audible. After a pause, she added, "Thank you for stopping. I didn't think anyone would." A chill ran through Daniel as he glanced over at her. Her voice was soft, almost fragile, and there was something odd in her tone, a hint of sadness, maybe even fear. He couldn't put his finger on it, but her presence made him increasingly uneasy. Trying to brush it off, he focused on the road, hoping the drive wouldn't take much longer. After a few minutes of silence, Daniel finally asked, "So what were you doing out here all alone? This road is pretty deserted at night." The woman hesitated, as if carefully choosing her words. "I was meeting someone," she said slowly. "Someone I thought I could trust, but they left me out here, just drove off and left me." Daniel's grip on the wheel tightened as a sense of dread crept up his spine. "That sounds awful. Do you want to call someone when we get to town?" he asked, though he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story. She shook her head. "There's no one to call," she replied, her voice barely a whisper. Her gaze remained fixed on the road ahead, but her eyes seemed haunted, as if she were seeing something far beyond the dark stretch of highway. A heavy silence settled over the car, broken only by the hum of the engine and the sound of the tires on the asphalt. Daniel felt the weight of her sadness filling the car, pressing down on him like a physical force. He tried to ignore it, but something about her demeanor began to gnaw at him, an unsettling feeling that he couldn't shake. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he saw the dim lights of a gas station up ahead. Relief washed over him as he pulled into the parking lot. He turned to the woman and said, "Well, here we are. You can call for help here if you want." But when he turned to look at her, his stomach dropped. The passenger seat was empty. Daniel's mind raced as he stared at the seat, his heart pounding. He hadn't heard the door open, hadn't seen her get out. She'd simply vanished. His hands were trembling as he scanned the parking lot, half expecting to see her standing outside, but there was no sign of her. It was as if she'd never been there at all. Trying to calm himself, Daniel took a deep breath and leaned back in his seat. Maybe he'd imagined it, he thought. Maybe he was just exhausted, and his mind had played a trick on him. But when he looked down, he saw something that made his blood run cold. A small, delicate scarf, neatly folded and lying on the passenger seat. He picked it up with shaking hands, the fabric cool to the touch. He was certain she'd been wearing it when she'd gotten into his car. But how could it be here if she hadn't actually been there? As he sat there, trying to make sense of what had happened, he heard a voice, a faint, almost ethereal whisper that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. "Thank you for stopping," it said, barely more than a breath. He froze, his heart pounding in his chest as he glanced around the empty car, the empty parking lot. There was no one there, but he couldn't shake the feeling that someone, something, was watching him. He quickly threw the scarf down, started the engine, and drove away, leaving the gas station and the chilling encounter behind. In the days that followed, Daniel couldn't shake the experience. He told a few friends, hoping they'd laugh it off and make him feel like he'd just imagined it. But instead, one of his friends looked at him with a pale, stricken expression. "You picked up a woman on that road?" the friend asked, eyes wide. "There's a story about a woman who haunts that stretch of highway. She died in a car accident years ago. They say she tries to find someone to give her a ride, but she never makes it to town." Daniel laughed nervously, dismissing it as just another ghost story. But late at night, as he lay in bed, he couldn't help but think of the woman's sad, haunted eyes, the way she'd spoken so softly, almost like a memory. And every so often, when he drove down that road, he'd catch a glimpse of something, a figure standing on the shoulder, waiting. The next time he drove that road late at night, Daniel found himself scanning the shoulder nervously, half expecting to see her again. And just as he passed the spot where he'd picked her up, he saw it. The faint figure of a woman, standing in the fog, her hand raised in a silent plea for help. His heart skipped a beat as he recognized the outline, the same woman with the same lost expression. Terrified, he sped past, gripping the wheel tightly and refusing to look in his rearview mirror. But as he rounded the bend, he couldn't help himself. He glanced back and saw her standing in the road. Watching him drive away, her figure slowly disappearing into the mist. The mirror from Craigslist. Kate had just moved into a new apartment and was excited to decorate. She wanted a large, vintage mirror as the centerpiece for her living room. After scrolling through dozens of listings on Craigslist, she finally found one that seemed perfect. It was an ornate, antique mirror with a carved wooden frame, and the price was surprisingly low. The seller, an older man named Mr. Aldridge, explained in his ad that he needed to get rid of the mirror quickly, saying it had too much history for him to handle. Kate laughed it off, assuming he meant it was simply old and fragile. She reached out, and Mr. Aldridge responded almost immediately. He was eager to meet, almost insistent that she come that evening, and he even offered to deliver the mirror himself, which she found odd. But his urgency made her think he was just a motivated seller. Within an hour, he showed up at her apartment, the massive mirror carefully wrapped in blankets. He barely spoke as they carried it up to her unit together. After they propped it up against the wall, he handed her a small envelope. "Take this," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Keep it with the mirror. It's important." Confused but not wanting to seem rude, Kate nodded and took the envelope. Mr. Aldridge lingered, staring at the mirror with a look of deep unease, then muttered, "Good luck," before quickly leaving. As soon as he closed the door, Kate felt a strange chill in the room. She shrugged it off as excitement mixed with a bit of adrenaline, happy to finally have her unique find. The mirror itself was stunning. The frame was intricately carved with images of vines and animals, almost lifelike in detail. She was fascinated by how it seemed to have an unusual depth to it, like the glass didn't just reflect, but somehow held a layer of darkness within. Still, she shrugged it off, thinking it was just the unique craftsmanship that made it so enchanting. A few days later, strange things began to happen. It started with her noticing subtle movements in the reflection that didn't match her own actions. One night, she caught a glimpse of her reflection smiling even though she knew she wasn't. She laughed it off, thinking she was tired or that the lighting was playing tricks on her. But as the days went by, the occurrences became harder to ignore. One evening, as she was watching TV, she glanced at the mirror and saw a dark figure standing just behind her. Startled, she whipped around, but the room was empty. Her heart pounded as she stared at the mirror, feeling a creeping dread. She took a few steps closer and peered into the glass, but there was nothing unusual. She told herself it was just her imagination, maybe a shadow from outside. That night, she remembered the envelope Mr. Aldridge had given her. She hadn't thought much about it, but something inside her urged her to open it. When she tore it open, she found a small, folded piece of paper with shaky handwriting that read, "Do not look at the mirror after midnight. Whatever you see, do not interact." The warning sent chills down her spine. She wondered if it was some sort of prank or just a silly superstitious note, but the feeling of unease wouldn't leave her. She tried to brush it off, thinking Mr. Aldridge was just a strange, eccentric man, but she couldn't help the growing sense of dread whenever she looked at the mirror. As the clock neared midnight, she found herself drawn to it, almost like it was calling her. She tried to ignore it, burying herself in a book, but a strange compulsion forced her to look. She finally gave in and walked over, staring into the glass. Her reflection was there, but it looked different somehow, almost distant. Then, her reflection raised a hand and waved, though Kate herself hadn't moved. Panic surged through her as she stepped back. Her reflection didn't. It just stood there, grinning at her with an unsettling, twisted smile. Heart racing, she closed her eyes, hoping it was just a nightmare. When she opened them again, the reflection was still, matching her movements, but that disturbing smile lingered in her mind. The following days grew worse. Kate would see herself in the mirror out of the corner of her eye, moving on her own, doing things she wasn't doing, like brushing her hair or even standing up when she was sitting. Once, she even saw her reflection staring directly at her, mouthing words she couldn't hear but felt deep in her bones. It was as if the mirror held a different version of her, one that was eager to break free. Frustrated and scared, Kate decided she'd had enough. She called Mr. Aldridge, demanding an explanation, but there was no answer. She looked up his address from the Craigslist listing and decided to confront him in person. When she arrived at his house, an elderly neighbor noticed her standing outside and walked over. She asked if Mr. Aldridge was home, but the neighbor looked at her with a strange expression. "Mr. Aldridge?" the neighbor repeated, her voice filled with confusion. "He passed away over a year ago. Heart attack. His family cleared out his belongings." Kate's stomach turned as she realized the implication. She had just met with someone who wasn't supposed to exist anymore. In a panic, she rushed home, her mind racing with fear and confusion. She had to get rid of the mirror. She couldn't bear another night of strange reflections and unexplainable occurrences. She listed it back on Craigslist, hoping someone else would take it off her hands. Within minutes, she received a message from a user with the same name, Mr. Aldridge. The message simply read, "You can't get rid of it, it's part of you now." Terrified, she threw her phone down and backed away from the mirror, watching her reflection as it smiled that sinister, twisted grin. This time, it mouthed the words slowly and deliberately. "Part of you now." Realizing there was no way out, Kate wrapped the mirror in blankets and hid it in her closet. She covered it up, hoping out of sight would mean out of mind. But every night, she could feel it calling to her, pulling her to open the door and look. She tried to resist, but the compulsion grew stronger each night. One night, she awoke to find herself standing in front of her closet, her hand on the doorknob. Her mind screamed in protest, but her body was moving on its own. She opened the door, staring at the mirror. Her reflection was waiting, grinning wider than ever, a malicious gleam in its eyes. She couldn't move, couldn't look away, as her reflection reached out toward her, its hand pressing against the glass as if trying to break through. The next morning, Kate's friend came over to check on her after not hearing from her for days. She knocked, but there was no answer. Finally, she let herself in, calling out Kate's name. The apartment was eerily silent, with a heavy, oppressive feeling hanging in the air. Then, the friend's eyes landed on the mirror. At first, she thought she saw Kate's reflection in it, standing still, looking back at her. But as she got closer, her blood ran cold. Kate's reflection was inside the mirror, her face twisted in horror, her hand pressed against the glass as if she were trapped inside, unable to escape. The mirror now stood silent in the living room, reflecting only the empty room, at least to anyone else who looked. But those who got close enough would see a faint outline, a terrified face staring back, forever frozen in horror. And from within the glass, Kate's muffled voice could sometimes be heard whispering, begging anyone who looked to help her escape. Craigslist can be a great tool for buying, selling, and meeting people, but it also carries risks. These stories aren't just cautionary tales, they're reminders that meeting strangers can be dangerous, even in what seem like ordinary transactions. The next time you respond to an ad, remember these stories, and be careful out there. If you found these stories chilling, give this video a thumbs up, subscribe for more like this, and check out the next video on the screen for more spine-tingling tales. Thanks for watching, and stay safe.